Maria Theresa was never supposed to rule. She was a woman in an age when women didn't rule. Her father, the Holy Roman Emperor Karl VI, Charles VI, had no sons, so he created something unprecedented, a document called the Pragmatic Sanction that declared his daughter could inherit the throne, and then he died. Maria Theresa was 23 years old. She had no military experience, no political experience. The major powers of Europe, Prussia, France, and Russia, saw a young woman on the throne of Austria and saw weakness. They invaded. What they didn't know was that they were about to face one of the most effective rulers in European history. Maria Theresa didn't just survive, she rebuilt Austria from the ground up. She reformed its military, its economy, its education system. She held her empire together while fighting multiple wars against multiple enemies. And she did it while raising 16 children and maintaining a moral code that would have collapsed a lesser person. In my view, Maria Theresa is the most underestimated figure in European history, not because she was a woman, because historians have spent so much time celebrating the men who fought against her that they never bothered to ask, what did she actually accomplish? The answer is almost everything that made Austria great. Maria Theresa was born in 1717 to Emperor Karl VI, Charles VI, and Elizabeth Christine. She was the eldest child, but she was not the son her father wanted. In the Habsburg succession, women didn't inherit. Women married into power. They didn't wield it, but Charles VI had a problem. He had no sons, he had daughters, and the Holy Roman Empire needed an heir. So he created the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal document declaring that if he had no sons, his eldest daughter would inherit. It was revolutionary, but it was also risky. The other powers of Europe, Prussia, France, Spain, all had claims to Austrian territory. They had tolerated the Pragmatic Sanction because they assumed Charles VI would have a son eventually, but he didn't. In 1740, Charles VI died, and Maria Theresa, at age 23, inherited not just a throne, but a crisis. She had no military, her treasury was empty, her neighbors were sharpening their knives. Within months, Prussia invaded. Friedrich II, Frederick the Great, young, ambitious, and ruthless, saw a young woman on the throne and decided to take advantage. The War of Austrian Succession lasted 8 years. Maria Theresa lost territory. She lost battles, but she never lost, because she understood something Frederick the Great didn't. You can win battles and still lose a war. You can take territory and still lose an empire. Maria Theresa's strategy was different. Hold on, survive, rebuild, and wait for your enemies to make mistakes. Between wars, Maria Theresa did something revolutionary. She reformed Austria. She looked at the empire she inherited and asked, why is it so weak? The answer was complicated. The nobility had too much power, the military was outdated, education was haphazard, the economy was inefficient, so she changed everything. She centralized power, she reduced the nobility's autonomy, she created a modern bureaucracy, she reformed the military so thoroughly that Austria became militarily competitive again. She invested in education, she created schools for common people, not just nobility. She understood that an educated populace was stronger than an ignorant one. In 1774, she issued the Schulordnung, an education ordinance that required all children, regardless of status, to attend school. This was revolutionary. Most rulers didn't care if common people could read. Maria Theresa understood that education was power. She reformed the legal system. She codified law. She made the system more rational, more efficient, more fair. None of this happened overnight. None of it was popular. The nobility hated losing power. The church resisted her secular reforms. The people had to adapt to new systems, but it worked. Within 2 decades, Austria was no longer the weak, chaotic empire Maria Theresa had inherited. It was organized, efficient, and militarily strong. And she did this while fighting wars, while raising children, while maintaining a personal moral code that would have been easier to abandon. The most famous conflict of Maria Theresa's reign was the 7 Years' War against Frederick II of Prussia. This was the war that defined both of them. Frederick the Great was everything you have been told he was: brilliant, ruthless, innovative. He reorganized the Prussian military into the most effective fighting force in Europe. Maria Theresa was his opposite in temperament. Where Frederick the Great was cold and calculating, she was moral and principled. Where Frederick II was willing to sacrifice anything for power, Maria Theresa was willing to sacrifice power for principle. On paper, Frederick II should have won. Prussia was smaller, poorer, less populated than Austria, but Frederick the Great had something Austria didn't: absolute freedom from moral constraint. He invaded, he won battles, he took territory, he committed atrocities, all for the glory of Prussia. Maria Theresa fought back with everything she had, but she was fighting a man who had no limits. The war lasted 7 years. At the end, Prussia was exhausted, Austria was exhausted. Nothing had really changed territorially. But something else had changed. Frederick the Great had proven that Prussia was a major power, and Maria Theresa had proven that she could match him. She didn't win the war, but she didn't lose the empire, and that was the victory that mattered. But here's what makes Maria Theresa complicated. She was deeply moral. She believed in God. She believed in virtue. She believed that a ruler had moral obligations. And yet she did things that were profoundly immoral. She persecuted Jews while claiming to be enlightened. She participated in the passion of Poland, literally dividing up a sovereign nation with other powers while claiming to be a defender of order. How do you reconcile these things? The answer is you don't. You live with the contradiction. Maria Theresa was a product of her time. She believed in absolute monarchy. She believed in Christian virtue. She believed that some people were meant to rule and others were meant to obey. By modern standards, she was oppressive, but by the standards of her time, she was remarkably progressive. She faced constant moral dilemmas. The welfare of the state often demanded actions that conflicted with her personal morality, and she made the choice, repeatedly, that the state came first. She expanded religious tolerance while still persecuting those she deemed threats. She improved conditions for peasants while maintaining feudal structures. She believed in education and science while maintaining absolute control over what could be taught. She was not a hero, but she was not a villain. She was a ruler operating within the constraint and possibilities of her era, and in my view, that's more interesting than either extreme. Maria Theresa had 16 children. 16. By modern standards, that's unimaginable. Even by the 18th century standards, it was a lot, and she was involved in their lives. She didn't just have children and delegate them to nurses. She was present. She wrote to them. She advised them. She worried about them. Her marriage to Franz Stephan was arranged, as all royal marriages were, but by all accounts, she loved him deeply. When he died, she wore black for the rest of her life. She raised her children to be rulers. She taught them duty. She taught them that their personal feelings mattered less than the empire. Some of them became great, some of them mediocre, some became problems. Her son, Joseph II, who would become co-ruler and then sole ruler after her death, was shaped by her example and continued her reforms, sometimes pushing them further, but all of them carried her values. What's remarkable about Maria Theresa is that she never let motherhood interfere with her role as empress. She never excused herself from ruling because she had children. She never apologized for prioritizing the empire. She simply did both. It exhausted her, it shaped her, but she did it. And that might be her greatest accomplishment, proving that a woman could be a mother and a ruler, that these things weren't mutually exclusive. Maria Theresa ruled for 40 years, from 1740 to 1780. When she died, Austria was a different empire than when she inherited it. It was more organized, more efficient, more militarily competitive, more educated. Her reforms created the framework that would allow Austria to survive for another 137 years, until 1918. That's not coincidence. That's the result of a woman who understood that short-term power means nothing. Only systems matter. Every reform she made, the centralist bureaucracy, the improved military, the education system, the legal codes, these things outlasted her by generations. Her son, Joseph II, continued her reforms, sometimes pushing them further and sometimes pulling them back. Her grandsons inherited an empire that was stable and well organized. This was her gift, not spectacular victories or territorial conquests, but an empire that worked, and for a ruler, that's the greatest legacy. Maria Theresa is often overlooked in history. We know Frederick the Great, we know Napoleon, we know Bismarck. We don't know Maria Theresa. Partly because she was a woman, partly because she didn't conquer vast territories, partly because she wasn't as dramatic as the men around her. But the more I study her, the more I think she was more effective than any of them. Frederick the Great built the most efficient military machine, but it consumed Prussia's resources and made enemies everywhere. After his death, Prussia faded. Maria Theresa built systems. She created an empire that could survive wars and crises, an empire that lasted another century and a half. She wasn't as brilliant as Frederick the Great, she wasn't as innovative, but she was wiser, and wisdom over time beats brilliance. Maria Theresa understood that ruling isn't about winning wars, it's about building something that lasts. That's why she should be remembered. What strikes me most about Maria Theresa is that she was an underdog 3 times over. First, she was a woman in a man's world. She was never supposed to rule. Second, she inherited a weak empire at a moment when it was surrounded by enemies. Third, she was moral in an era when morality was a luxury most rulers couldn't afford, and yet she didn't fail. She didn't become a tyrant. She didn't abandon her principles. She didn't try to be a man. She was herself, and she built an empire on that foundation. As an Austrian, I'm proud of her, not because she was Austrian, but because she understood something that Austrians, I think, have always understood, that lasting power comes from building things that work, not from theatrical displays of force. In my view, that's the kind of leadership we need now, not the Frederick the Great types who are willing to destroy everything for power, but the Maria Theresa types who understood that lasting power comes from building systems, not conquering territory. She didn't win every battle, but she won that war that mattered, the war for her empire's survival and prosperity, and that's a kind of victory that echoes through centuries. Maria Theresa achieved great things while maintaining moral principles that would have been easier to abandon, but she also did immoral things, the persecution of minorities, the partition of Poland. How do we judge a historical figure who was both? And can we admire someone's accomplishments while condemning their actions? Let me know in the comments. Maria Theresa was never supposed to rule. Frederick the Great invaded to take advantage of her youth. The other powers of Europe circled like hyenas. She was a woman in an age when women didn't rule. She had no military experience and no political experience, but she understood something her enemies didn't, that lasting power doesn't come from winning wars, it comes from building systems that survive wars. She reformed Austria, she centralized authority, she improved the military, she invested in education, and 137 years after her death, the empire she rebuilt was still standing. She wasn't a conqueror, she was a builder, and as an Austrian, I think that's something worth remembering.